Welcome, everyone. I'm Glenn Branch, Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education. We're thrilled to have you join us for our Scope Centennial webinar series, in which we continue to explore the legacy and ongoing relevance of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. This webinar is the second of three sessions that address the past, present, and future in this 100th year since the first major battle over evolution education in the United States. Today's session, Bryan's Religious Opponents, Protestant, Modernists, and Science, features Edward B. Davis, Ted to his friends, who is Professor Emeritus of the History of Science at Messiah University. Ted is the author and editor of the recent book, Protestant Modernist Pamphlets, Science and Religion in the Scopes Era, which you'll find reviewed in the latest issue of Reports of the NCSE. Before we get started with today's TED Talk, so to speak, a few quick notes. Again, this is just one event in our year-long Scope Centennial celebration. Be sure to register for the remaining webinar in this series at ncsc.ngo so you don't miss it. If you do happen to miss a session or want to revisit a talk, each of the three webinars will be available on NCSC's website at a later time. If you'd like for us to continue to make opportunities like this possible, please consider making a donation to NCSC. Your support truly makes a difference. There will be a Q&A at the end of today's talk. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll pass them along to Ted as time allows. Thanks again for joining us, and let's get started.
To start things off, Glenn mentioned the book, and this is the cover of the book. You'll see the cover talked about in just a few minutes. This is a story that hasn't previously been told because it's about materials that have been previously ignored or even just never seen by most people, because the materials themselves were very, very peripheral to modern university libraries. They were pamphlet literature, religious tract literature, rather than printed books or journal articles or even magazines and newspapers, which university libraries routinely do collect. So the type of literature made it almost impossible, I would say, to find these physically if you wanted to see one today, even though in the 1920s they were all over the place. Roughly 1 million of them were printed and distributed throughout the 1920s. So let's get into the story. The title of the book refers to the Protestant modernists. And I want to make sure we're on the same page in who they were. What did that term mean? Well, the modernists, to give a short definition, they were the religious liberals against whom the fundamentalists, who are much better known by name today, against whom the fundamentalists responded. And I would say it was for a period of roughly 20 years, from 1910, 1930, something like that. I would say just for the years surrounding what was called at the time the Great War, that we call today World War I. Now, the term fundamentalist ultimately derives from the set of publications you're looking at right now. It was a series of 12 paper-bound volumes containing 90 articles, sometimes by the same author more than once. But these articles were an attempt to defend traditional views of the Bible and Protestant theology against the group already existing known as the modernists. The modernist was a self-chosen label, as was fundamentalist. The term fundamentalist itself, though, wasn't coined until 1920 to label a movement that already existed. The defining document is an editorial in a Southern Baptist journal called the Watchman Examiner, which was a newsprint type magazine, as you can see here. The editor himself, a Baptist minister named Curtis Laws, applied the term to himself and to other like-minded people. He had just returned from a Baptist convention and talking with people about these issues, the issues within their church, about how some people were challenging traditional views of the Bible and theology. And those who wanted to defend the traditional views decided to use the term fundamentalist to label themselves. He said in a paragraph in this op-ed that's blown up for you on screen. He said, "We suggest that those who still cling to the great fundamentals and who mean to do battle royal for the fundamentals shall be called fundamentalists." Then he goes on to say, by that name, the editor of the Watchman Examiner, that is himself, he's speaking of himself in the third person there, is willing to be called. It will be understood then, when he uses the word, it will be in compliment and not in disparagement. That language does seem to imply, doesn't it, that the word has already been being used at least a little bit verbally before the first print use. But this is the first print use we know of. It's in July of 1920. So this is a group that's defining itself over and against the already out there group of people who call themselves modernists. To get a sense of what the modernists did believe, or maybe more properly, what they did not believe, I'll show you a cartoon that is on the cover of the book. This particular cartoon is from 1924, regardless of what you might find on the internet. It was not published until 1924. It was actually defined by Bryan himself verbally in a letter that he wrote to the publisher of the Sunday School Times, which was a very prominent Christian periodical at the time. And he suggested that the cartoonist for the Times, a very famous Christian cartoonist named E.J. Pace, whose signature you can see right down here underneath the title, Descent of the Modernists, that Pace depict three men, says Bryan, descending a staircase on which there is no stopping place. That's how he puts it in this letter. In other words, it's a slippery slope. He says the first of these men would be a student stepping from Bible not infallible to man not made in God's image. And halfway down, he says there'd be a minister with a Bible in his hand, stepping from no deity, meaning no deity of Jesus, to no atonement. And then he says at the bottom, there would be a scientist stepping from agnosticism to atheism. Now, Bryan believed that this is what evolution did. Evolution, in Bryan's opinion, was the cause of modernism and of the progressive elimination of the vital truths of the Bible, as he put it. So the fundamentalist concerns about what modernism was doing are well depicted, in my view, in this cartoon. This is how the fundamentalists saw it. The modernists were giving up all of these traditional beliefs, which, in the opinion of the fundamentalists, all were crucial beliefs to the truth of Christianity. Now, Bryan himself, ironically, did not identify as a fundamentalist. That is, he didn't use the label for himself. He didn't say, I'm a fundamentalist. But he did share their concerns about evolution and some other things as well, higher education, for example. So the story full blown, now that you have that background on what fundamentalism and modernism were about, the story of my book begins with an editorial that Bryan wrote for the New York Times. It was published in February of 1922. In the opinion section, as you can see, section 7 of the Times, the special features section, and it went across half the page, God and Evolution. And the subtitle, the charge is that American teachers of Darwinism make the Bible a scrap of paper. So in this, Bryan put all of his standard arguments, if you're familiar with any of them, into this piece. I'm not going to review those here. I don't have time to do that. What I want to do is I want to see what evolved from this particular op-ed, because this is a very prominent place to put a piece of opinion. And indeed, of course, Bryan had been covered in the New York Times his whole political career, which stretched back decades at this point, as most of you probably know. But over the coming weeks, the New York Times published three more op-eds in reply to Bryan, all of them written by people from the New York area. The first was by Henry Fairfield Osborn. Again, many of you will know who he is. He was the American Museum of Natural History curator, and he wrote his piece. He published his piece in 1925, in the year of the Scopes trial. He published it separately in his book, The Earth Speaks to Bryan. He also published it in other places as well. So this is something that Osborn wanted to get out there to people. Now, interestingly enough, Osborn got involved in a controversy at the same time as Scopes and before it because of an exhibit he put up in the Museum of Natural History. The exhibit was that of human evolution. Had that famous picture, which I don't have in my slides, about a long chain of primates culminating in humans. But his exhibit was attacked, of course, by anti-evolutionists, including a prominent fundamentalist preacher in New York. The preacher's name was Straighton, John Roach Straighton. And he wrote an article about this, objecting to the exhibit and arguing that evolution is false in a very popular magazine at the time, a debate magazine called The Forum. And his article was called Fancies of the Evolutionists. This is the year after Scopes. So Osborne responded to that in an article he called Facts, F-A-C-T-S, Facts of the Evolutionists. And the article, Facts of the Evolutionists, ends with this image right here. And this is the existing facts of human ascent, as Osborne put it. And it shows indeed a racist line of evolution, culminating in four types of human beings, the highest of whom is the Caucasian, and the lowest of whom is the Australian Aborigine. Now, the point is not that Osborne believed these things. It's that he presented this as part of the facts of evolution, and this is the fact of human ascent. Scientific racism and eugenics were very closely tied to the presentation of biology in the 1920s in the textbooks. Indeed, a very large number of the textbooks focus a lot of space on eugenics and even perhaps less on evolution. But in any case, Osborne was both of those things. He was a eugenicist and a scientific racist, and he believed that evolution was part of both of those things. Now, the next editorial in response to Bryan was by Edwin Grant Conklin, a very, very prominent developmental biologist at Princeton, who was on the cover of Time magazine, as you see, in the 1930s. He became one of the most prominent public intellectuals concerning science in the country in the period from the 20s up through the 40s. And he also wrote a famous book a couple years before the Scopes trial called The Direction of Human Evolution that you see here. Now, Conklin wrote an editorial for the New York Times against Bryan, but he also served with Osborne and Charles Davenport, the famous eugenicist, on a AAAS committee that was charged with responding to Bryan. So Bryan's editorial comes out in early 1922. Conklin responds, Osborne responds, and we'll see there's a third response in a moment. But these two of those three people, Conklin and Osborne, were joined by Charles Davenport on this three-person committee that the AAAS responds to Bryan with. They organize a response, and it's related to the pamphlets in ways I won't go into here. But the point I want to make is that if you're looking at this controversy, suppose you don't have a dog in that fight, and you're looking at it from the outside in 1922, and you see who the AAAS sets up as their committee. What are you going to conclude? What you probably would conclude is that scientific racism and eugenics are a big piece of this evolution story. All three of these men were prominent eugenicists, and all three were scientific racists: Osborne, Conklin, and Davenport. Now, the third response was by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the most famous liberal preacher in the United States at the time. He was pastor of a Presbyterian church in Manhattan, got thrown out of that church for his modernism, ended up having a church built for him on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a church built by John David Rockefeller Jr. It's called Riverside Church. And Fosdick was also one of the first radio preachers in the United States. He had a national radio broadcast in the mid-20s and on. Such a good preacher, in fact, that one of the great preachers, another great preacher of the last century, Martin Luther King Jr., considered Fosdick the greatest preacher of the 20th century. He told Fosdick that much in writing. Now, the most famous sermon that Fosdick ever preached was called "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" And that's in May of 1922. I show in the book how it's probably building off of the op-ed he wrote back in March responding to Bryan about evolution. So there's a link there. Now, the replies by Conklin and Fosdick but not the one by Osborne, were published in September of 1922. You can see the pamphlet form they take here. They were published by an outfit called the American Institute of Sacred Literature. And when I found the first one of these, which wasn't one of these two, I didn't know who that was. It was also part of a series that's called Science and Religion, as you can see. That perked up my interest when I found them because I specialize in the history of science and religion, and I'd never heard of or seen these. And then each one has a different author, but the authors are all nationally prominent people. Altogether, there turned out to be 10 of these, as we'll see. And so what was this AISL, this American Institute of Sacred Literature? Well, it was a correspondence school for Protestant ministers in North America, run by the most famous modernist divinity school at the time, the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. So you could say this was kind of online or distance education 100 years ago. Ministers would write in, get a curriculum sent to them and books sent to them. They would write essays and have them graded in Chicago. That's how they could get continuing education as ministers all over the country, even if they're in some rural spot, say in North Dakota, where they're nowhere close to any kind of continuing education in a formal group. And so they participate in this. There's about 10,000 ministers who do that at the time. Those two pamphlets get accompanied by a third pamphlet published at the same time in September 1922. And that one is by Shaler Matthews, the very famous theologian who is the dean of the faculty at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And he's also in charge of the series. He's the editor of the series of pamphlets. So that's the first three. They come out, I say, in 1922, several months after Bryan launches his anti-evolution campaign. Now, down through 1931, over a period then of from 22 to 31 is actually 10 years inclusive, 7 more pamphlets are published. And the most famous author on the scientific side was Caltech physicist Robert Millikan, who had in fact only recently become the president of Caltech, which had only recently changed its name. It was originally called Throop Institute, and it was founded by a Universalist preacher who had made his money in lumber and who was wanting to see a practical education institute started. Caltech is private and it has Universalist religious roots. Robert Millikan himself was a Unitarian wing of the Congregationalist denomination, and his beliefs overlap considerably with the beliefs of the founder. I'm not meaning to imply that that's why he was hired at Caltech. I don't think it was. But when he went to Caltech as its first important president, the environment suited his religious sensibilities very well. Millikan's pamphlet was originally published, in fact, as a bulletin of the Caltech, and then as a pamphlet from the AISL. Millikan also wrote for the New York Times a famous statement about the compatibility of science and religion that was published in the mid-20s. And here you see it on the left, the opening paragraph of that statement. It's not signed by Millikan, but that's who was responsible for getting it published. He also wrote a book, even a collection of his essays called Evolution in Science and Religion, and many other books for the general public. He was conscious very much of publicity and of getting his ideas out there to the public. He believed in scientists taking time to educate non-scientists about what they thought. Another pamphlet called The Heavens Are Telling, a quotation from Haydn's oratorio, The Creation, was written by someone who may seem like a contradiction in terms, a blind astronomer. Yerkes astronomer Edwin Frost, who lost his eyesight one eye at a time after he had become an astronomer and therefore had to give up observation and become the administrator of Yerkes Observatory. Yerkes was the University of Chicago's observatory, and until very recently, it had a large telescope in Williams Bay, Wisconsin. He was a very active Congregationalist. In fact, his father-in-law was editor of the Congregationalist newspaper, and he wrote very little, surprisingly, about science and religion. This is almost his only statement to that effect. But there it is. Another one was the first one I actually found myself. This was got me started on this project. It was by someone that no one has heard of today until recently. I'll come back and explain why you might have heard of him. But the author's name was Samuel Christian Schmucker. His grandfather, Samuel Simon Schmucker, was one of the most famous Lutheran theologians in America in the 19th century. He founded Gettysburg College and Gettysburg Seminary. But he himself was not a Lutheran. He became an Episcopalian, and he taught at a place called Westchester State Normal School in Pennsylvania, now known as Westchester University. But he was, I think, fair to say, very much the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day, except that he was religious and Tyson is not. Um, what I mean by that is he was a hugely successful popularizer of science before live audiences, especially at Chautauqua, the main Chautauqua in New York, where he was often billed top for the whole summer. In spite of the fact that former presidents and famous authors would speak there, this guy drew the largest crowds. And it was because of the lantern slide illustrated lectures that he gave about nature. He was a popularizer of nature study, that famous movement. In fact, he was president of the nature study movement and Nature Study Society and during World War One. He was a popularizer of eugenics and of evolution. Now, if you have heard of him at all, it's probably because the science building at Westchester used to be named for him. 3 or 4 years ago, however, the college board voted to unname this because students found out about his interest in eugenics and called for him to be canceled in this way. Just as at Indiana, where I did my graduate work, David Starr Jordan was the person for whom the biology building was named, and he got canceled a few years ago because he was also a prominent eugenicist and scientific racist. Another pamphlet was written by someone who's not a Protestant and not a modernist. He's the exception in my group. He was one of the two most famous Serbian Americans in the country at the time. He and Nikola Tesla. Michael Pupin, a Serbian immigrant who won the Pulitzer Prize for his autobiography, which you see here right in the middle, and helped determine the boundaries of Yugoslavia at the Paris peace talks. I won't go into that, but you could ask about it if you want afterward. And on the right is his pamphlet, Creative Coordination. It's the shortest of all of them. And I mentioned the fact that he was an exception by being a devout Serbian Orthodox believer. He's actually a traditional Christian in many ways. I won't go into that further tonight. If you want to read about that, I could send you a link to a place you could find an article I wrote about that. Yet another pamphlet came along in 1928, and that was the second one by Fosdick. It's called Religion's Debt to Science, and it was published in the Ladies' Home Journal before it appeared as a pamphlet. It was also a sermon. And then the next to last one has three authors. Arthur Colley Compton, the Nobel laureate. He was the third American to get the Nobel Prize for Physics. He took Millikan's place at Chicago. When Millikan went to Caltech, they hired Compton. Compton, for those of you who have physics, you know who he was. His experiment on X-ray diffraction was basically the experimental basis for wave-particle duality that develops in the rest of the 1920s. He was also the person who told Leslie Groves to hire Robert Oppenheimer in the Manhattan Project, and he was Oppenheimer's boss during the Manhattan Project. This is a very prominent person. His essay on life after death was originally a chapel talk in Chicago at the University Chapel at Easter time, 1930. A second talk by Shaler Matthews, the theologian and divinity school dean, and a third by Charles Gilkey, who was the pastor of Compton's church, but he was also, at this time in 1930, the first chaplain of what's now called Rockefeller Chapel at Chicago. So those three men all did little talks, chapel talks for students about immortality, and they put them together in this pamphlet. So it's the longest. Compton wrote many other things, including he delivered the famous Terry lectures at Yale, which resulted in a book about human freedom called The Freedom of Man. And the last of the pamphlets in 1931 was by Stephen Jay Gould's close friend, Curtly Mather. Mather was a geologist. And as a young man, as a graduate student in Chicago, He had attended a Sunday school class taught by Matthews and appreciated the modernist theology and social gospel that he learned there. He also testified at Scopes trial. In fact, he's the person who suggested that very idea, that scientists be brought to Scopes to testify. And he helped Clarence Darrow prepare to cross-examine Bryan. So he became a very prominent person in the 1920s. And right down through the 50s and 60s, he was prominent because he was the editor, the book review editor for American Scholar and the book review editor for American Scientist, for both of those journals. But he was a strong anti-fundamentalist, and he wrote a pamphlet called The Religion of a Geologist, which was given first as a talk as a chapel talk at Harvard, and then published in Harvard's magazine and in this pamphlet. Among other things that Mather did is he wrote many books, including one about science and God, and he taught a Sunday school class at a Baptist church not too far from Cambridge, in which he featured prominent people visiting Harvard and Harvard faculty and himself. He did this for decades. It was called the Mather class. It even had literature printed to go with it so you could give to people to invite them to come. In the last part of his life, he became very friendly with Stephen Gould after Gould got to Harvard. In fact, Gould used to bring him into his classes to lecture about the Scopes trial. And he became a personal and I believe intellectual bridge between the modernists of the 1920s and later post-war people like the pantheistic astronomer Harlow Shapley and the Unitarian author Ralph Wendell Burho, who founded the journal Zygon. Um, I also suspect, I haven't proved, I don't know if I could prove it, that Stephen Jay Gould's NOMA view of science and religion actually came from Curtly Mather. It sounds exactly like Mather. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if there had been conversation about that and Gould picked it up and ran with it. Now, the pamphlets as a whole, the series, were mailed very widely in the United States. The first three, in fact, the ones responding directly to Bryan, were sent to 30,000 Protestant ministers, every high school principal in America that they had on the mailing list, at least, about 25,000, every federal and state legislator, YMCAs on campuses and in cities. Remember, the YMCA originally means Young Men's Christian Association. And so a lot of religious education happened through the YMCA and other campus ministries in more than 40 colleges and universities, as well as abroad. In fact, 4 of the pamphlets were translated into simplified Chinese. But the most important college story involved Dartmouth College. At Dartmouth, students had the very first required course on evolution, which they took as freshmen. It was taught by morphologist William Paton. And Paton used the first 3 pamphlets as required texts in the early 1920s in the class. Now, there's a close connection between Paton and the issues that are involved at the time with evolution and with religion. To give an example, you're looking right now at the title page of a book published in 1917, just as America was entering the First World War. And it was written by a prominent evolutionary biologist at Stanford, an entomologist named Vernon Kellogg. Kellogg was a pacifist at the time. He had followed his former student, Herbert Hoover, a Quaker, to war-torn Europe before the United States got involved in the war. You know, the First World War begins in August 1914. The United States doesn't get in until April 1917. So for roughly 2.5 years, America is officially still neutral. And during that period of time, Hoover and Kellogg and many others are involved with civilian relief efforts in the war-torn parts of Belgium and France. So Kellogg goes over there. He was educated for his doctorate in Germany, as were many American scientists of his generation. So he's fluent in German, and he's billeted while he's there in a house that's used by the local German officers as their headquarters. And he has conversations with these men all the time. And you can see from the subtitle of his book, it's based on conversations he has with German officers while he's over there. Basically, Kellogg hears the message that evolution means the survival of the fittest. And the survival of the fittest means that Germany ought to dominate the rest of Europe, that it's part of the law of nature that Germany should win out in a war for conquest. Kellogg's book, which has a preface by Theodore Roosevelt, as much as anything else, motivates Bryan to launch his anti-evolution crusade. There's a very close connection here. Bryan's extremely concerned about this particular form of social Darwinism, among other forms of social Darwinism that he's also worried about. Now, Patton wanted to combat that perception. And so his course, in his view, provided an alternative vision of biology as conducive to Christian ethical and moral principles. He even wrote an essay about this in the journal that used to accompany the journal Science. The journal Science has been published for a long time, since the 19th century. Around for many, many years, they also published a more literary magazine called The Scientific Monthly, but it was published by the same people. And here he writes an article called Why I Teach Evolution. And he tells people this. He says, the teaching of evolution is the only way to bring back a living God into those fields of human thought and experience from which the teachings of highbrow philosophy and lowbrow religion are excluding him with extraordinary thoroughness and rapidity. Perhaps the principal reason I teach evolution is because, and these are his italics, the methods of evolution exemplify the successful usage of the highest ethical and moral principles. He even went on to say that once living things appear, altruism becomes the chief aim and pleasure in life. And he says this is the essence of the moral and ethical teachings of Christianity. And so then he goes on to say, science is religion, and religion is science. This is what he means by that. So he concludes by saying, evolution makes God a more imminent reality. It helps all of us to understand the purpose of life and how to accomplish it. That is why I teach evolution. So you've seen what some of the things that Bryan's religious opponents believe. Let me treat it more systematically here and more summarily. I would say this. First, in general, the modernists understood God in far more abstract terms than most other people of biblical faith, Christians and Jews alike. And sometimes they sounded a lot like Albert Einstein. For example, look at the second quotation under this, the one from Conklin. If anything in the universe is to be called God, it seems to me that it is this underlying principle of law and order. Millikan said almost exactly the same thing as you see here on this slide. The God of science is the spirit of rational order and of orderly development. This is why Millikan said he couldn't imagine an intelligent man who didn't believe in God. When Millikan said that, that's what he meant. Um, and Matthews defines God in an italicized portion of one of his essays in the bottom quotation, where he says, God is our conception, born of social experience, of the personality evolving and personally responsive elements of our cosmic environment with which we are organically related. Now, that's a pretty complicated definition. And indeed, on one occasion, according to Robert Millikan, Millikan wrote this in his own autobiography. He quoted Matthews at this point. When Matthews was asked by someone whether he believed in God, and Matthews answers, according to Millikan, he says, that, my friend, is a question which requires an education rather than an answer. Most of the religious people I know who, if you ask them if they believe in God, they'll tell you yes or no. They'll give you one word answer, as opposed to what Matthews was doing here. It's also the case that the modernists just completely reject what's often called reductionism, the idea, the tendency that some scientists have to explain everything or explain it away, if you will, even human beliefs and behavior, in purely mechanical terms. Some of the this. But the modernists just completely reject that approach. They think it's illegitimate philosophically and scientifically. And they say things such as what you see here in the first quotation from Fosdick. This is from his pamphlet, in fact. Origins prove nothing in the realm of values, he says. Origins prove nothing in the realm of values. Or what Compton says, we could, in fact, see the whole great drama of evolution moving toward the making of persons with free intelligence capable of glimpsing God's purpose in nature and of sharing that purpose. In such a case, we should not look upon consciousness as the mere servant of biological organism, but as an end in itself. An intelligent mind would be its own reason for existence. And there's other quotations like that all over the place in these modernists. As you've just seen, then, to emphasize this specifically here, modernists saw evolution as progressive and purposeful within a teleological universe that was designed. In fact, this quotation might interest many of us. This is a surprising quotation, perhaps. Compton said this in a sermon he gave in 1940 at a Unitarian church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, not too far from where I live. He said, "The chance of a world such as ours occurring without intelligent design becomes more and more remote as we learn of its wonders." There are other quotations to this effect that I have on the slides. You can review those when this is posted. I want to move on to the next point. Now, modernists held various opinions about personal immortality. There is, after all, one pamphlet devoted to that. Compton believes in personal immortality. Not everyone in the movement does. Conklin does not, for example. But they all rejected the resurrection of Jesus and other biblical miracles. They all did. Everyone I read where they express a view on it, it's a negative view. In fact, to emphasize this, something Compton's late son John Compton told me. Compton refused to recite the Apostles' Creed when he was in church because he did not believe the virgin birth, the incarnation, or the resurrection. And in fact, in his pamphlet, Life After Death, he makes no mention of either Jesus or the resurrection, which are indeed startling omissions for a Christian. Likewise, Conklin endorsed something that he himself called the religion of science. Conklin called it that. And when he's speaking about this to the public, here's one of his outlines. He speaks to how the religion of science has no personal God, no miracles, no supernatural revelation, no personal immortality, and no objective efficacy of prayer. So these are the kinds of things the modernists do not believe. Not all of them disbelieve those things Conklin was saying, but Conklin does identify in many ways with the modernist wing of Christianity, even though he describes himself as a pantheist. And finally, this is my main point about the big picture. The modernists, I would say, uncritically and enthusiastically accepted something known in historical circles as the conflict thesis, associated with Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. Many of you have heard about that. I can detail it in the questions if you want, but I won't take time to do that here. That ultimately gives its highest expression in the book you're seeing here, the 2-volume work by Andrew Dixon White, the first president of Cornell, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. White himself identified as a very liberal Christian, but he believed that traditional theology had to be thrown under the bus if you're going to make progress in America. Well, to sum up what they thought about this and the influence of the warfare thinking, let me quote Edwin Arthur Burt. Burt was a leading American philosopher and intellectual historian in the 20th century, one of the leading people. He was also an active member of the Hyde Park Church, which is where Compton, Matthews, and Gilkey were, and many others. He sums up what he saw happening around him in this quotation. "How much can I still believe?" is the question pathetically asked. Beginning with 2 score or more doctrinal articles, there ensues a process of elimination and attenuation until today in liberal circles, the minimum creed seems to have been reduced to 3 tenets: belief in God, confidence in immortality, and conviction of the spiritual uniqueness of Jesus of Nazareth. Not the divinity of Jesus, but the spiritual uniqueness. Thus, the pathetic game of give what must, hold what can, continues. Burt basically gives the same analysis of modernism as Bryan had given in that cartoon with which I started, The Descending Staircase, a series of denials of traditional Christian beliefs. That's how he saw what was happening from the inside. Bryan saw it that way from the outside. And to take this further, about White specifically and the warfare view, the need to abandon Christian theology in the name of progressive thinking and of science. Fosdick was a traditional Christian when he went to Colgate University as a freshman. The summer afterward, he read White's book, and here's what he said. He found shocking facts about the way the assumed infallibility of Scripture has impeded research, had deepened and prolonged obscurantism, fed the mania of persecution, and held up the progress of mankind. This sounds like Carl Sagan, if you will, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or Richard Dawkins. That's what it sounds like to me. He says, he rose in indignant revolt against the old stuff I had been taught. And likewise, Conklin says the similar things. He says that reading Draper and White, he says, showed the impossibility of harmonizing many traditional doctrines of theology with the demonstrations of modern science. Well, if you've ever read, I'm going to skip this part, if you've ever read Draper and White or read about them today, you know that today historians don't believe any of this stuff. I mean, White was writing propaganda, and so was Draper. This is a very inaccurate picture of history, even though White himself was an historian. In fact, the first president of the American Historical Association. His work is garbage historically. But these people were relying heavily on this in what they were constructing. The final image to wrap this piece up is from the Library of Congress collection, which shows a cartoon by Udo Kepler called The Last Stand, Science versus Superstition. It's basically White, published in 1899, 3 years after White's book. The modernists are over here under the label Think or Be Damned, and the fundamentalists are over here under the banner Believe or Be Damned. The light is showing on them, so these guys are in the darkness and these guys are not. And they're firing history, archaeology, evolution, and enlightenment, and geology. That's what the barrels of the Gatling gun are labeled, with ammunition from rational religion, historical facts, and scientific facts. So this image of science as progressive, traditional religion as backward and obscurantist dominates so much American thinking at the turn of the century and at least halfway through the 20th century as well, I would argue. So my takeaway piece would be this, that the fundamentalists certainly saw themselves in a culture war, such as you see here, involving science, and it continues today. And I know that I'm sure that Adam Letts will say more about this next week. Everybody agrees with that. However, my work shows how the modernist attitudes that the fundamentalists fought against were closely tied to the conflict thesis, which had dominated so-called progressive thought since the 1870s. In short, the culture war leading to Scopes began decades earlier, and it was driven more by secularism and religious liberalism than by evolution. Are they views gone today? No, they're not. If you know who this is, the late Bishop Spong, he was an unrepentant repeater of the warfare view. That was his view of science and religion. He gave it all the time, including his last lectures used to talk are just the warfare view personalized through him. Bryan is basically Philip Johnson. The late Philip Johnson is basically Bryan again. Both are older earth creationists who think that evolution is not true and morally dangerous. But there's a third group today that wasn't there, and this is it. A group that's almost entirely absent in my research. I couldn't find these people in the correspondence and the publications I read. Eminent scientists who accept evolution and yet affirm traditional Christian beliefs. People like Francis Collins, Nobel laureate Bill Phillips, or the late Charlie Towns, who's often regarded as one of the greatest all-around physicists of the 20th century. So there's many, many others like this today. They weren't in the 20s. They weren't there. I found one who was prominent like this and one who was less prominent like this. So what do you want to know that I didn't talk about?
Thanks very much, Ted. The first question we have for you, did any of the modernists respond specifically to the evolution-friendly contributors to the fundamentals, such as George Frederick Wright, B.B. Warfield, and James Orr?
That's a nice question. I didn't see them doing that. Um, they Wright even has a couple essays in the fundamentals. But I would point out that all of those people named were dead by 1920. And the The thinking that many Christians had done in the 19th century about evolution that was not confrontational was pretty much disappears among the conservative Protestants of the 1910 through 1930 period. It gets very, very polarized and confrontational in that time. It's hard to find moderate voices, either on the theological issues or on the scientific issues. It's hard to find moderate voices amongst the conservative Protestant community then. Now,
And
a
a
lot of people
related
are
question,
quiet. A lot of
oh,
people are
sorry.
quiet, but that means I don't know what they thought.
And a related question is, given the presence of some evolution-friendly contributors to the fundamentals, how is it that fundamentalism hardened into an anti-evolution view by the time of the Scopes trial?
Well, there's a lot of reasons I think why that happens, but one of them, a big one, is the First World War. Now, the fundamentals themselves, to be fair, are published before the war even begins in Europe. They're out. But during the war and after the war, the image of evolution as tied with German militarism, such as was discussed in Vernon Kellogg's book, becomes dominant. Let me show you an image. Give me a second here. I have it ready to go. Right here. This image is from the Sunday School Times, which was the religious weekly that where Bryan corresponded with the editor, and Bryan gave the staircase cartoon as a suggestion. The same cartoonist, E.J. Pace, did this particular cartoon right when Bryan gets going in 1922. And notice how it's depicting William Jennings Bryan. This is Verdun. Of course, if you remember your history, Verdun was an enormous battle between the French and the Germans during the First World War with dozens of forts, multiple armies. I don't mean multiple corps or multiple battalions. I mean multiple armies involved, millions and millions of men fighting each other. And the French battle cry was, "They shall not pass." And outside the walls of Verdun are the enemies of the Bible in this depiction. And of course, they are implicitly German in this image. And these are the people who are with Bryan. So the fact that the cartoonist chose this image to depict his war hero, if you will, Bryan, um, is very telling. There's other images I could show you that I don't have time tonight to show you, but I could easily show you multiple images of the same kind of theme. That is, the enemies of the Bible being Germans. And this is partly because of Ernst Haeckel's worldwide atheistic evolution, really, promotion at the turn of the century, partly because Wellhausen and other Bible critics had come from Germany, the higher critics. So higher criticism gets associated with Germany. Molecules to man evolution, as Ken Ham calls it, gets associated with Germany. And fundamentalists are looking to have this German influence dissipated in and after the First World War. That's a big part of it, I think. It's not the whole story, but it would be a big part of it.
We've got another question. Were any women involved in these discussions? And if not, why not?
Yeah. Well, in the book, there's a woman who features fairly prominently. The reason she's not in my talk is she didn't write any of the pamphlets, but her name was Georgia Chamberlain. She was the executive secretary for Matthews at the Divinity School in Chicago. She herself was an author of pamphlets, but not these, not the ones on science and religion. She also wrote books on her own about biblical scholarship and theology. And she was um, one of the very first women I think of in those circles in the early 20th century, in those liberal Protestant circles who had actual prominence. But she didn't contribute to the series. I had to define my book narrowly by the pamphlets themselves and what those authors had written there and in other places in order to make a project have enough focus to be manageable. But that's an excellent question. She was involved, but she wasn't involved in these specific science and religion things.
We've got another question. Did anyone in your research say that it's a mistake for theologians or religious people to tie religious doctrine to facts that might be disputed or disproved by further scientific research?
A few people do in the correspondence with Matthews. I didn't talk about this, but when these pamphlets are published, in order to raise funds for for more of them, the AISL courts the financial support and moral support of elite American scientists. Now, the way they defined that was defined by science itself, by the scientific establishment itself. The first directorate, biographical directory of American scientists is printed around 1906 or thereabouts. It's called American Men of Science. That's members of the AAAS or American Men of Science. Even women are men of science. And that name doesn't change till the 1970s as that publication continues. It's now called American Men and Women of Science. And in the original editions, the first three editions at least of that book, if you were regarded by your peers as eminent, and they did this by secret ballot with the editor of this, then you had an asterisk next to your name. You were a starred scientist in American Men of Science. And those are the people that the AI after for financial support and moral support. They courted them. And about 100 or so send in financial support and correspond with Matthews about their religious beliefs. There's a lot of that in the book. I didn't talk about that here, but there's a lot of that basis to these people. So that happened a lot. And some of those people assert a position exactly like what you said, that it's not a good idea to tie one's religious beliefs too closely to scientific beliefs, because they can change. That there's not a lot who do that, but there's enough that it's a noticeable stance at the time.
Okay, and just one last question. Who was the prominent moderate and the less prominent moderate that you found in your research that you mentioned,
Okay.
anticipating Francis Collins, for example?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the prominent one, the one that was starred in American Men of Science, was William Bliss. Let me just grab my book for a second, make sure I get this right. Because nobody's heard of him today. Yeah, William J. A. Bliss, who was a Roman Catholic convert to Episcopalianism, was a physicist at Johns Hopkins. He basically says to Matthews in his letter, I think you're doing good work here, but there's no way that science disproves the virgin birth or the resurrection of Jesus, things like this. He basically reads the riot act to Matthews on this, saying science doesn't have the competence to do that. And so he takes what I would call an intermediate position on these issues. He's prominent then. The other one who's not so prominent then was Henry Higgins Lane. I know it sounds like I'm making that name up, but he was at University of Kansas, and he was the head of the Natural History Museum there. He was a former student of Conklin at Princeton. And Lane was a traditional Christian who wrote a book about Christian beliefs and evolution in the 20s, in which he argues basically the same thing Bliss is arguing. And he's saying that, for example, evolution has nothing to say about the divinity of Jesus. Okay, things like that. And he goes on to develop that position at some length. So they're the two I found that occupy this kind of middle ground that's very common today, but was not common in the 20s, as far as I can tell.
Okay, thanks, Ted, and thanks everybody for attending. Remember, this is just one event in our year-long Scope Centennial celebration. Be sure to register for the remaining webinar in the series at ncsc.ngo so you don't miss it. That will be a week from today when Adam Lotz will speak on the Scopes trial, the start of America's 100-year culture wars. If you do happen to miss a session or want to revisit a talk, each of the three webinars will be available on our website at a later time. And again, if you enjoyed this event, please help us offer more of them in the future. Our work to promote science literacy and challenge threats to science education is funded by people like you. We invite you to make a contribution today at ncsc.ngo/donate-scopes-2025. And for those of you who already support our work, thank you.